Thank you so much for having me here. I won't waste time on pleasantries and thanks, but they're heartfelt. January next year will mark 75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. And I think those of us that live in Europe know that that moral weight of the Holocaust does weigh heavy in European society and political culture and in broader social culture. It's been described, that never again Auschwitz is this profoundly felt moral imperative on European governments. However, I think last week it was the UN Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide, Adama Dieng, warned in Geneva that what he identified as the warning signs of the 30s, the 1930s, are returning to Europe. Based on this very history, Europe can and should be a global leader in protecting populations from identity-based violence within and at its borders, as well as its contributions abroad. But instead, at the moment, Europe could be seen instead to be lacking in its contributions to what is, I think we can all agree, an increasingly urgent rather than less so agenda. Identity-based violence and the indicators of it are worsening across Europe. I say that coming from Brexiting Britain, and the divisions in our country have been seen long before that referendum, but very much now are worsening, hardening, and becoming more extreme. It's becoming increasingly necessary for European states and European civil society to strengthen prevention at home in order to enhance that protection of their populations, including minorities and migrant populations, as well as do better abroad. So my proposal today, and I'm very pleased that Special Advisor Karen Smith sort of set out that yes, we do still need some conceptual thinking about the responsibility to protect, because I know sometimes it's been said that we do too much of that, but I completely agree. My proposal is that unless the global north can better connect the prevention of identity-based violence at home within our own borders and what we are trying to prevent abroad as donor states, then one, the seriousness of these rising risks within our own borders, within Europe's borders, will continue to be missed, and that slide towards the far right, towards intolerance, towards marginalisation and the violence against groups will increase. But also, Western development and Western foreign policies will retain what we know is a problematic political and conceptual bias. And the Western states will increasingly leave themselves vulnerable to, I think, quite justified and increasingly justified accusations of double standards and hypocrisy. So my question, I guess, from those that proposal is, do the pillars of R2P offer a useful framework for the European case and for European civil society? In focusing upon the responsibilities of European states across these pillars, can we, as those of us interested in the prevention of identity-based violence, of mass atrocities, of R2P, can we redress those real and perceived geopolitical biases that are associated with both the concept and the norm and that collective responsibility of the responsibility to protect? And so my remarks are drawn from what is in the very early stages of a longer working paper. So it's not quite an academic presentation, but it's also probably not what I could get away with my civil society colleagues. So I guess the questions that I kind of put to the room, this is what I'm thinking about at the moment. If this is the case, and R2P does pose a useful framework, can the R2P community, and I don't just mean in Europe, I mean civil society, international NGOs, on the state level, regional organisations around the world, how can we coordinate to shift that conceptual and political dial? And if it is not a useful framework for the European case, and in fact using the pillars to tackle those domestic challenges, those regional challenges is not appropriate, then maybe actually that is a very good lesson for European and Western actors that are involved in dialogues around R2P in talking to countries where we think that actually it's a very useful framework for those but not for us. I've been thinking about this idea of pluralising access to the pillars. Despite the collective nature of the responsibility to protect, how the norm is upheld remains very disjointed and disconnected. This is largely because most R2P architecture that exists, whether we look at it from the INGO level or within the UN Security Council, exists at a multilateral, quite high up, quite elite level. It's not yet filtered down. In Western states, in Europe, those R2P mechanisms that my Foreign Office, for example, is most likely to engage with are externally facing completely, but also interstate rather than interdepartmental. Moreover, in Europe, as in with other Western democracies, almost situated wholly within the foreign ministries. Their activities look out, but R2P very rarely on a European case looks in. And so I'm interested in exploring this concept of a shared responsibility and how that can be pluralized and perhaps even democratized, in addition to, rather than replacing, its existence as a norm and principle within the United Nations system. And perhaps, as with the protection of civilians in armed conflict, as R2P exists within the UN Security Council, it must remain something that is conceived as narrow but deep. However, I think we're now at a stage in its teenage years that R2P can maybe kind of start stretching out. I think Karen Smith said, we have to take it out of New York and out of the UN system. The challenges that so often characterize assessment of R2P highlight the disconnect between these high-level efforts and the reality of what is felt on the ground by those local communities who, quite frankly, we hear again and again, don't care what they call the norms that protect them. One of the things that bridges that high level and that grassroots is civil society. Protection approaches works on a national level, and we can bridge our own communities in the UK that we work with, but we can also work with our colleagues who are based in the UK who have access and engagement with communities all over the world. And then we can then sort of pass up, connect with our own duty bearers within the UK. But because of these gaps that are said to characterize R2P, it's very common to talk about how we can address the conceptualization and the implementation, how we can narrow or bridge the gap between early warning and early action, the imbalance between words and deeds. And again, civil society has a huge role to play here. It's these gaps that I think have led in recent reports from the Secretary General to emphasise states to integrate into existing mechanisms national approaches to accountability and contributions. This is crucial. But these enormous gaps are going to require far more than national commitments. Moreover, nation states and policymakers don't make those changes if civil society isn't pushing. That needs to be joined up, and it involves all of us, academics, NGOs, diplomats, parliaments, and so on. So the need to join up those dots, I think, is evident. It is time, I think, for R2P and what it represents to move beyond the UN, beyond the Security Council, and it has to be seen as something that belongs to all of us. This might require a conceptual and a practical shift, but I don't think necessarily a big one. However, to date, attention of European civil society engaged in atrocity prevention, and those that would consider that its remit, even if it is externally facing, is a very small community indeed, are disproportionately focused on Pillar 2 and Pillar 3 contributions. This is despite that moral weight of the Holocaust, although notably the absence of Bosnia, of Northern Ireland, Ukraine, the Second World War, histories of colonialism, which don't seem to weigh on our collective shoulders in nearly the same way. Likewise, analysis of Europe's contribution to prevent atrocities and its contribution to the collective responsibility to protect has almost exclusively focused on internationally facing endeavours. The 2013 Task Force on the EU Prevention of Mass Atrocities, for example, made no mention of either Europe's responsibilities towards its own populations or EU responsibilities to its borders. And sure, that task force report came out a couple of years before the most recent dramatic shifts to the right in Europe. But let's not forget the Prime Minister in Hungary, who now is overseeing a radical movement against minorities, was already ensconced. We had already seen in 2012 Marine Le Pen secure a stunning 20% of the vote, which broke all previous records. And in Greece, we were seeing, I'm sure you will all remember, the real resurgence and kind of strength of Greek far right in the black-shirted Golden Dawn, who were beating up migrants in the street and being encouraged by the police. And yet this report made no mention of an internal concept of a responsibility to protect. Moreover, it included in its analysis a very useful table of long upstream early prevention tactics of ensuring that all states outside of Europe and that Europe should be contributing to the greater support of inclusion of minorities, stronger democratization, tackling hate speech, social and economic inclusion. Anyone looking at Europe now, I think, must see that those norms are needed to be strengthened in Europe, however. I don't want to just bash the task force report. The US version that came first did exactly the same. It is, a perhaps not surprising evolution given the history of our R2P's conception. I wonder in this room how many of you are studying Europe's R2P. I wonder when we're in Brussels next week whether, these concerns in Europe, the upcoming elections in Europe, which look set to be quite frightening, I think, will be on the agenda of the focal points. I don't know. However, it does remain, I think, a real obstacle. The problem is that it is built on this premise that we must overturn that either atrocities are something that must be prevented in some countries and not others, or that some countries have already done all that they can for Pillar 1. And from my position, neither are true for Europe. Now, I'm going to sort of try and, I guess, use my remaining time to think about what we are doing in the concrete. I could talk a lot about the conceptual evolution, but I know that I'm being looked at, not to go over. So as I said, these headlines are drawn from a kind of longer piece of work that I'm thinking about, but that is underpinning a very practical set of activities that protection approaches in partnership with a number of European colleagues and others are taking forward to set out a kind of exploration, I guess, if that doesn't sound too soft and too open, to seek out more inclusive narratives and new, more sustainable ways of working in Europe that match what we are preventing at home and what we're preventing abroad, what our responsibilities are within our own borders, at our borders, closer to home, as well as our responsibilities abroad. Over the coming 6 months to a year, Protection Approaches is going to be working with this network of European partners to bring together European civil society, including academics, for workshops, for an online consultation about Europe's approach to the prevention of identity-based violence, including mass atrocities, to discuss the advantages and the very practical next steps of harmonising European civil society efforts, but also to make sure that those efforts are matched up with existing structures, with existing commitments that exist on state level, that it can communicate with the focal point network more effectively. A very concrete thing that we're going to seek to do is match up within European states the great academic research that is being done in almost every country in Europe with the great NGO prevention work, whether that is internally or externally facing, again, that is being done in every European country, and focal points and European structures and national structures to facilitate peer-to-peer dialogue for those that are confident and have experience of best practice, and those that have access and a drive and yet perhaps have not yet come to those same conclusions. We're having the next meeting in Brussels. I'm very pleased to say that the UN office will be joining us. I'm very grateful to the External Action Service who are hosting us, and I think that this is a really important thing to acknowledge, that the EU has taken this decision to host this meeting in its External Action Service, and we are looking across the 3 pillars of R2P, not just Europe's externally facing contributions. Europe, to be sure, benefits from a very varied, robust and expert human rights civil society sector. However, few organisations consider domestic or international contributions to predicting or preventing identity-based violence and atrocities in the terms of R2P. Our work in the UK has shown that there is national appetite within that broader human rights civil society, academic institutions, our parliament, and even, despite Brexit, within our government departments. The result is that we are now having an evidence-based, collaborative, inclusive dialogue that after a period of not really much activity in the UK at all, I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about that in the next presentation. We're now making these important steps forward conceptually and in practice. And I'm interested in seeing if the same principles can be applied here in Europe. And so I sort of invite you to have a think about that and look forward to hearing your thoughts on some of those questions later. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'm sorry for being strict, but